Hello all, and welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin this important webinar, we want to take a moment to honor the significance of today's date, which is September 11th. This is a day that reminds us both of the resilience of communities and the importance of compassion in times of crisis. So as we reflect and hold space for the significance of this day, we also are going to be turning our focus to the vital work that we all do. Today, I'm honored to be one of your speakers. My name is Claire Hopkins, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a training officer with Switchboard with a focus on child and family services. Prior to joining Switchboard, I worked at my local resettlement agency in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with unaccompanied refugee minors and unaccompanied children, where I recruited foster parents and did community engagement. I also have experience in, and I'm passionate about advocating for the LGBTQ+ community, as well as domestic and sexual violence survivors. I hold a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology from Grand Valley State University. And next, I'm delighted to introduce today's second speaker, which is Switchboard's Senior Training Officer. Jenna Christie-Tabron is an experienced trauma-focused mental health clinician, educator, and consultant who has served in psychiatric, healthcare, judicial, and education settings. Before joining Switchboard, she was the intensive case management supervisor at the International Rescue Committee in Phoenix. Jenna holds master's degrees in family therapy and social work and is currently pursuing a Doctor of Education degree with a specialization in organizational leadership. So by the end of today's session today, we hope that you will be able to, one, define trauma and its impact on attachment and the cognitive, emotional, and social development of unaccompanied refugee minors, as well as recognize the behavioral presentations of the 4 types of attachment, and finally, apply practical strategies and interventions to alleviate attachment-related challenges that URMs may experience. So Jenna, over to you to walk us through our first learning objective today.
Thank you, Claire, and hello, and thank you for joining all of us today as we go through the first of 3 learning objectives, defining trauma and explaining its impact on attachment and the cognitive, emotional, and social development of unaccompanied refugee minors. First, we would like to hear from you and figure out how might you define trauma. Please join us at slido.com or by scanning the QR code on your screen with your mobile device. If you join in your web browser at slido.com, please type in the number on your screen and just tell us how might you define trauma. Some responses we have coming in now: a violent or disruptive event, detrimental and violent experiences, overwhelmed, painful experiences, fear, disruption in normal development, overwhelming negative sense of powerlessness, loss, response to a terrible event, lasting negative effects, inability to cope, adverse response to a stimulus, being outside one's control. As you see the responses are coming in, we're starting to see several themes, and the themes are listed at the top of your screen. That we're noticing that there's a commonality, that it's an event, it's an experience, it's painful, it's about our responses, lasting wounds. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. We're going to leave this open, and you're more than welcome to continue adding responses. But as you can start to see that there are many commonalities in the responses that we've received thus far, a lot of themes that are coming up. And we're going to address the different themes as we continue. So what is trauma? We understand that there is no single definition of trauma. However, trauma does contain some very common elements, as you would have seen already in the Slido that we just participated in. It may be deeply disturbing, frightening, or life-threatening. It may be outside of what is considered ordinary or normal. It may result in feelings of being overwhelmed, helpless, or feeling being at someone else's control or someone else's mercy. And it may have short-term or long-term negative effects on someone's physical, emotional, psychological, and/or spiritual being or impacts. When working with refugee clients, it's important to note that every person is very unique, and what may be traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another. So in talking about what it is, we have to identify that there are multiple types of trauma. You have acute trauma versus chronic trauma. Acute trauma results from a single distressing event, while chronic trauma arises from prolonged exposure to stressful situations, and both types can severely impact the mental health of unaccompanied refugee minors. There's also complex trauma, and complex trauma involves multiple traumatic events over time, often of an interpersonal nature, that can lead to profound disruptions in URM's sense of safety and stability. So to be able to give us a framing definition for today's webinar, we will use the definition that gives us the model of the 3 E's of trauma. First being event. Traumatic events happens in a developmental context. So for children and youth, particularly potentially traumatic experiences, not only the events that directly happen to the child, but they could also be events that happen to their caregivers as well. Children are so dependent on their caregivers, especially in infancy and early childhood, that a threat to a caregiver is also perceived as a direct threat to their safety and their survival. The experience of events. What is really critical in understanding the impact of trauma on individuals is their experience of the event. What may be traumatic to one child, as we mentioned, may not be traumatic to another. How they interpret the event is very important. When thinking about the experience of the events of children, we also consider the age in which the traumatic experience occurred. So something that a 13-year-old may have easily been able to cope with, it may be overly overwhelming for a 3-year-old. And additionally, with our newcomer clients, we have the most experience with multiple traumas at different ages and at different stages of development, which can lead to complex presentations. And lastly, we have the effects of the events. When we talk about the traumatic stress, we're talking about the emotional, physical, or behavioral interactions that may occur following exposure to traumatic events. So the impact of a stressful event on a child depends in part on the degree of the stress response provoked, the duration of the response, and it also depends on the child's experience of the events. So what may be traumatic to one may not be traumatic to the other, and the protective factors in their lives, such as supportive adults. Protective factors work as buffers to help lessen the effects of traumatic events. So children and youth, particularly unaccompanied refugee minors that are seeking sanctuary, have experienced multiple ACEs, or what is called adverse childhood experiences, across their migration journey. So for more information on ACEs, we encourage you to look at that study that was conducted in the mid-90s to learn more about how stressful situations impact the body and impact long-term health effects for individuals. Noting that the original study was conducted in the 90s, there is really a focus on only 10 adverse childhood experiences. However, since then, many more have been recognized. A child's responses to adversity typically depends on multiple factors, including the age in which the trauma occurred, severity, frequency, and duration of the trauma, the child's biological, emotional, cognitive, and social development can all be impacted depending upon the age and stage in which the trauma occurred. Each age and stage of the development has critical milestones or tasks that need to be accomplished to master that stage of development and successfully move on to the next stage. However, when these events occur, they prohibit the accomplishment of certain tasks in these milestones, and they can have negative ripple effects throughout the child's lifespan of development without proper intervention. So today we're going to take a look at the common trauma reactions according to 3 basic developmental periods throughout childhood. First being infancy and early childhood, otherwise identified as birth through 5. The earliest years of a child's development, middle childhood, ages 6 to 11, or the period known as primary school or elementary school, as well as adolescent stages from ages 12 to 18, the time of middle school and or high school. It's important to also note that the traumatic stress reactions that we're going to discuss today are all normal reactions to abnormal events. So when children are exposed to trauma at the different ages and stages, we have to support them throughout these experiences. These reactions become concerning when they impact the daily functioning of the child or the adolescent. And these can be significant warning signs for us to pay close attention to the child and check in a little more frequently. So now we'll talk about some of the developmental states and how trauma impacts development and attachment. But before we do that, we do have another Slido for you. And we would like to hear also from you as to what traumatic stress reactions do you see in your work with URMs. Once again, if you have just joined us, you can join Slido by scanning the QR code on your screen or by joining through your browser at slido.com and typing the number in at the bottom. Sleep issues, avoidance, anger, isolation, becoming secretive, regressive behaviors, stomach issues, so the physical representation, hyperindependence, so there's a theme here. I'm seeing a lot of anger. So there's a theme here with the emotions, the emotional responses, trust issues, difficulty bonding, abuse, mistrust, emotional outbursts, substance abuse, social anxiety, self-harm, hypersexuality. Thank you. Once again, as we can see at the top of our screen, there's a commonality in the work that you're all doing, seeing a lot of anger and anxiety and avoidance seeming to have some of the highest responses thus far. Thank you. Once again, the Slido poll will continue to be up as we continue to proceed through the typical developmental stages. So we're going to walk through and talk about what typical child development looks like at each stage, and then we will address traumatic stress responses for each one. Although we know that many unaccompanied refugee minors are in the adolescent age range, it's important just to briefly cover the developmental states prior to adolescence, as youth have experienced trauma throughout those stages as well. So in beginning with infancy and early childhood, it's important to mention that attachment actually begins in utero, right? But from birth to 5, what we're looking at with typical development is looking about the ability to start to regulate behavior, physical function, and emotion. As children begin to progress towards age 5, that attachment is developing. The attachment to the caregiver and to other people in their immediate surroundings are beginning to develop, and they're being introduced to the concepts of behavior regulation. But traumatic stress reactions, behaviorally, that's increased fussiness and crying. So that is not being able to fully communicate verbally what the needs are. So therefore, you have more behavioral representations of what that child needs and what they're trying to convey or express. So the acting out of these traumatic incidents can come out in play. The difficulty with separating away from a caregiver because that's the trusted adult now, and talking less. Somebody also mentioned on the slide regressive behaviors. So one of the most common regressive behaviors that you could see is a child that has been successfully potty trained. Maybe now it's engaging in bedwetting. That's one of the most common regressive behaviors that can be seen as a result of traumatic stress. Transitioning, moving through early childhood, emotion regulation is starting to really develop, but that's being developed through co-regulation with a trusted caregiver. We learn self-regulation through co-regulation with an adult or someone that we trust because they're teaching us and modeling what regulation should look like. They're learning the ability or being introduced to the ability to hide their emotions, but it's very concrete and literal thinking. They have not developed the capacity to engage in abstract thinking as yet, as they're learning to form a sense of security and safety amongst their environment. So from an emotional standpoint, there's a generalized fearfulness, especially with separation from a caregiver. There's an understanding of helplessness and that dependency upon a caregiver, and confusion about events that may not understand the permanency of death. That is very important to remember when you're thinking about the capacity for concrete thinking, because sometimes when we're trying to explain the concept of death to a child, we try to minimize the trauma that can come from explaining what it is. So a very common response that a caregiver might say when somebody dies is to say that that person is just sleeping. They're going on a very long sleep. Well, for a child who has concrete thinking and very literal thinking, they could now develop an unfounded fear of nap time or bedtime because they're not having the understanding as to it's an abstract thought of an extended sleep and not waking up. Another emotional response that can be seen are the nightmares and other sleep issues that can occur, and other sleep issues such as insomnia as well. And all of those can go into a fear of bedtime and vulnerability because of that lack of control. In middle childhood, that typical development through ages 6 to 11, we're looking at the increased ability to start regulating the behavior and emotion, granted that you had a caregiver to help with co-regulation. The reflection upon consequences before acting, we're starting to do some more critical thinking and having an awareness of the consequences of expressing an emotion. So that's the concept of, yes, you can feel how you feel, but how do you show how do you feel? And it's the development and the connections that we're making with peers are starting to build more importance. So that attachment is starting to extend beyond a caregiver, beyond an immediate family, and to more peer connections. However, the traumatic stress responses that are associated with middle childhood, from a behavioral standpoint, you're looking at repetitious play and retelling of the situation throughout the behavior. Sometimes the irritability or the aggressive behavior is something that has been seen that was very commonly mentioned in the Slido with anger. And so what we're looking at is we're thinking, I don't know how to process my emotions. I know that I'm hurting. And so my default response or my default safety mechanism is through anger. Somatic complaints, and there was also mentioning of stomach issues or headaches. Most often in children, traumatic stress represents itself with through physical symptoms. That's the headache and that's the stomach ache. And then there's social withdrawal and school avoidance and not wanting to be around or involved in the stressful environment or in or around those who may pique one's stress. So the emotional reaction that supports the traumatic stress reaction of middle childhood are feelings of responsibility or guilt. Sometimes those external situations are now internalized, and there are negative feelings of responsibility and of guilt that weigh on the child. And they're thinking somehow at some point in time, it was their fault that the situation occurred. Concerns about their safety and the recurrence of the events. Could this possibly continue to happen again? And what is the hyper awareness of their caregivers' anxieties? So is my caregiver scared? Are they afraid? If I'm looking to you and I'm dependent on you, but you're afraid, what does that mean for me? Should I now be afraid? And the continuation of nightmares or sleep issues as well continue throughout middle and childhood. In adolescence, we're looking at the typical adolescence as increased independence. This is the time where we're definitely looking and seeing a bigger connection with peers. It's an identity, it's a sense of belonging that is coming through peer relationships. And we're seeing more self-awareness and more self-reflection that's occurring here during this developmental stage as opposed to with younger children. But with traumatic stress reactions, the behavioral representations can be the acting out and the increase in risky behaviors. Some things that were mentioned in the Slido were the hypersexuality or maybe engaging in substance use. The social withdrawal can continue during this phase or excessive participation in certain activities that require or that show up as avoidance. Declines in school performances, declining in grades, and reactiveness to reminders of the traumatic events. When certain reminders occur, it can send the body into a state as if that the situation is currently being experienced. So that reactivity is a very strong indicator of an experience of traumatic stress. And from an emotional standpoint, URMs struggle with emotional regulation on a regular basis, experiencing intense and unpredictable emotions that can interfere with daily functioning. The increased risk for anxiety and depression, the trauma that is experienced by these minors can lead to heightened levels of anxiety and depression, affecting overall mental and emotional well-being as well. So some other emotional responses here are shame and guilt. So we've transitioned from not just the responsibility, but also just experiencing shame and embarrassment surrounding what has happened and internalizing that as well. And wondering about, is something wrong with me? Am I abnormal? And what is it going to take for me to be normal? And trying to understand, what does normal mean? So a lot of internal thought processes that happen when we're talking about adolescence, because this is a critical time in a child's life, regardless, where they're trying to find who they are. So during a normal adolescent development, with the typical development, these are questions that might be asked anyway as a sense of belonging and who am I? But coupled with trauma, those questions now take on more traumatic reactions, more stressful reactions that interfere with day-to-day functioning. Cognitive development is one of the first stages of development or types of development that we want to address that has that is negatively impacted following traumatic stress. There is an effect on learning and memory. Trauma can impair cognitive functions such as memory and attention. It can hinder academic performance and overall intellectual development. Trauma impacts the way that our brain functions, the way that our brain processes information. So what could look as if maybe the child is just not grasping the material or maybe not applying themselves in an academic setting could actually be an impairment or an impact on the cognitive functioning. Okay. As we know, trauma has chronic activation of the lizard brain, of the bottom half stem of the brain, with the constant activation of a flight or fight response. So when the lower part of the brain is chronically activated over and over and over again, the other parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, other areas of the brain that are responsible for decision making and impulse control and memory and learning, are less activated and are therefore not developing at the rate that they typically could have been developing. So therefore, what we know is that persistent stress and trauma can negatively affect the executive functions of the different areas of the brain, which are crucial not just for daily life, but also academic success. From a health and criminal justice standpoint, we talk about how it may not how health and criminal justice may not show this youth may not show distress in situations where it would normally be expected. So therefore, that sometimes can manifest themselves as being fearless or being what we would call it being a daredevil in very risky situations. Okay. The direct manifestations of attachment difficulties, in particular in healthcare settings, is that children with attachment difficulties may not show the type of distress even when seeking or accepting comfort. So they may appear to be okay on the surface, but internally there are significant challenges. So it may not exhibit or indiscriminate against friendliness towards strangers. Behaviors can be particularly noticeable in inpatient settings, and the behavioral representations are often interpreted as deviance rather than the results of mental health challenges. So what that looks like so what that could look like here, especially with criminal justice, is that that anger that is being seen as that is a protective factor for the individual is being mistaken as maybe oppositional defiant disorder. And so it's being criminalized rather than treated from a mental health perspective. From a social standpoint, we're looking at the difficulties in forming meaningful relationships due to the challenge with trusting others. So that is a lot of the mistrust that we talked about. However, what we mentioned is that what we saw with the typical development, peer relationships are extremely important. So when those relationships are becoming strained because there's an inability to be able to form positive relationships, what we are seeing is that there's a greater risk of withdrawing and self-isolation, feelings of loneliness and detachment. And our overall attachment, which encompasses the cognitive, the social, as well as health and criminal justice standpoints as well, we're seeing the disruption of the natural process to form secure attachment bonds. So the trauma disrupts the natural process, and that means that they experience inconsistent caregiving. So that inconsistent caregiving can occur because maybe they're going from shelter to shelter. It could occur through the different stages of the triple trauma paradigm with the migration process. And because they have not had the opportunity to develop a very strong connection with any single adult or any small group of adults, that leads to mistrust, and that leads to a detachment of emotional connections, not only with the foster parents, but also the staff. And that inconsistent caregiving creates intense complications to be able to form those healthy relationship patterns, even when a stable environment has been identified. And that concludes our learning objective 1. And I will pass it back to you, Claire, to take us through behavioral representations.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Now that we have defined trauma and its impact on attachment, the cognitive, emotional, and social development of URMs, we're going to be talking about the second learning objective, which is to recognize the behavioral representations of the 4 types of attachment. So to begin, we'll start by learning and discussing attachment theory, which explains the emotional bond between a caregiver and a child, and we know that this begins developing in the first year of life. This bond helps establish a sense of safety and security and is influenced by how well the caregiver responds to the child's needs during times of distress. It's important to note that a child can form different attachment styles with various caregivers based on their experiences of safety and responsiveness. So, as Jenna mentioned, for URMs who may have had multiple caregivers due to trauma, separation, or loss, these disruptions can deeply impact attachment, trust, and emotional well being. As for caregiver distress, such as fear, mental health challenges, or trauma, this can also affect the child's sense of safety. These early bonds shape how children express upset and influence their ability to form stable relationships as they transition into adolescence and adulthood. As we move through to the next slide, we want to remember that attachment theory goes beyond identifying behaviors. It helps us understand the emotional bond behind those behaviors. And now we'll explore how different attachment styles manifest, which can inform how trauma impacts URMs. So the 4 key types of attachment are anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and secure. So now we'll go into and think about how these attachment styles may manifest behaviorally in URMs. And while we're doing this, we want you to keep in mind that attachment styles can shift throughout different stages of life. So for anxious attachment, youth may often display clingy behavior with a constant need and seeking reassurance due to a deep fear of abandonment and rejection. Youth may struggle with inconsistent boundaries, demanding attention, and then may become upset or anxious when it's shared with others. For example, if a teacher interacts with other students. So this reflects that difficulty in understanding and respecting social boundaries, which you may see with anxious attachment. On the next slide for avoidant attachment, you may see children tend to maintain emotional distance and rely heavily on themselves, avoiding dependency on others. You may see that they often set rigid boundaries. And if we think about a school example or foster parents, they may refuse help from teachers and caregivers and struggle to express their emotions, which can then make them appear detached or uninterested in close relationships. As for disorganized attachment, children often display erratic and unpredictable behavior, reflecting some kind of inner turmoil and confusion. They may have chaotic boundaries, such as alternating between seeking comfort and reacting aggressively, as well as showing signs of fear and confusion and really struggling to respond consistently to caregivers' actions. We also know that with disorganized attachment that this style is most directly linked to acute trauma, which refers to a type of trauma that results from a single intense or distressing event. Then finally, for a secure attachment, we may see youth who feel comfortable seeking help and expressing their needs and emotions to caregivers. They often engage positively with peers and adults and manage their emotions effectively, exploring new environments with confidence, respecting personal space and social cues. And an example of this might be that they wait for permission before using a classmate's belongings. So now that we have covered what the four types of attachment look like, let's now incorporate attachment related behaviors of URMs. So for attachment, for anxious attachment, we may see URMs that struggle with transitions, showing distress and anxiety with each move, as Jenna had talked about in the development, between refugee camps, between shelters, between foster homes. And they might tend to cling to their aid workers for constant reassurance, fearing such abandonment. If we think about school, they might display separation anxiety, seeking excessive reassurance from teachers and peers due to insecurity from past losses. As for avoidant attachment, some of the things that URMs may display is they manage their emotions alone. They avoid discussions about their refugee experiences with their caregivers, teachers, counselors, and even foster families. They may avoid forming close friendships because of a fear of further loss. While in foster homes, you may see that they struggle to bond due to feelings of emotional pain or not having that information or awareness of how to cope. And they may start shifting to more focusing on more practical needs. So things like food and shelter. And I think we see that a lot with URMs with teens where they've arrived feeling and they have this established sense of independence. And so their focus is more on these practical things and often tend to avoid that emotional and psychological engagement in order to protect themselves from any more vulnerability. For disorganized attachment, URMs may display conflicting behaviors between school, alternating between that compliance and acting out due to unresolved trauma. They may have difficulties trusting authoritative figures or people in authority, such as teachers, caseworkers, counselors. And this comes from the things that they have survived in their migration and negative experiences with authority figures. You may also see some of these similarities in a foster home. So they may react more with fear or aggression, showing that inconsistent attachment and that erratic behavior. Or they may respond unpredictable to trauma triggers and struggle with that stable environment that a foster home or a program is introducing as they have been experiencing chaos and instability. Finally, with secure attachment, we may see URMs show resilience in learning. They're asking questions. They want to go further in their school or in their adult life skills. They're seeking support as needed, and they actively engage in their cultural adaptation. They participate in activities, maybe that is taking place with their therapist or counseling. They engage with their classmates. And in a foster home, you may see them starting to feel comfortable discussing the past experiences that they've survived, which leads to a better understanding and support and forms a healthy relationship and attachments between the foster parents and themselves. So understanding these different attachment styles, it helps us better support URMs in various settings, whether you are working in a school setting, foster parent, or directly for an organization. Before we move on to our next section here, we want to highlight some special considerations to be aware of and mindful of while URMs are adjusting to their new environments. So first, recognizing that late age of arrival for most URMs, making it feel unnatural to adjust to new caregivers amidst numerous other changes and things that they have to complete upon arrival. It'll be important for staff to distinguish between attachment-related behaviors and normal expected behaviors, such as being distant, being anxious about new things, meeting new people. So we want to make sure that we're not over-labeling, but we're really considering the information that Jenna presented in our first learning objective and thinking through these different attachment styles so that we can make sure we're providing the best support and resources for youth. We'll want to evaluate the challenges in accessing attachment-related behaviors versus those typical developmental responses that were discussed. Make sure that we understand the conflict that some youth have experienced about having their own family being replaced with new relationships. And finally, it's been noted that in some practice that youth will have familial connections even in their home countries. They may display better attachment-related behaviors due to encouragement from family to connect with their new families. So we have another Slido here for you all. Now that we've covered the 4 different attachment styles, we want to hear from you who are actively in the field about what style you see the most often in your work. Anxious, I see. Anxious and avoidant. Yeah, absolutely. Some disorganized. And you can join this in the same way that you've joined the other Slidos by scanning the QR code or joining at slido.com. I see a couple of secure. That's really great. I'm sure that there's been that transition period of being in 1 or 2 different attachment styles in different spaces. So you might be able to select more than one here. But I'm seeing anxious and avoidant be the common themes here, which definitely makes sense with the different examples that we've talked about. All right, so to wrap up this session or this learning objective here, we are going to move on to a couple of case scenarios in order to help us recognize attachment styles through behaviors. And I'm going to ask for Jenna to come back on and help us facilitate these last couple case scenarios, please.
Thank you, Claire. So our first case scenario that we're going to go through is Maria. Claire will also be posting this as well for you all to have in the chat, but I'll read it out loud for you. Maria is a 16-year-old from Honduras, has been in foster care for 4 months. She was separated from her mother during their journey to the United States and doesn't know where her mother is now. Maria has been placed with a foster family. She's very affectionate and frequently seeks reassurance from her foster parents. She often asks if they will keep her or if she'll be moved to another home. When her foster mother leaves the house, even for short errands, Maria clings to her and asks, well, are you coming back? What if something happens to you? Sometimes Maria cries and calls her foster mom repeatedly until she returns. So based off of the information that you have in the case scenario, the wonderful information that Claire just presented, which attachment style does Maria's behavior most closely match? All right, I was giving it a moment just to see if we had any other responses. Okay, anxious. The anxious is winning. Have a little bit for secure. The majority is saying anxious. Yes. All right. And anxious would be the correct answer in this situation. Keeping in mind that you will see some similarities, there will also be some overlap in the representation and what the symptoms can be. But overall, this what we know about Maria, especially with the constant reassurance, that desire to remain close and not wanting to be separated, those are really clear indicators of anxious attachment, that chronic worrying as to what can happen, what's going to happen if you leave the house or you're separated for too long. Also keeping in mind that a significant indicator that this is anxious is also her age. She's 12 years old at this point in time. So that separation anxiety is a developmental milestone that should have been successfully accomplished by now. All right. And our next scenario that we're going to go through. All right. All right. So Imran is a 17-year-old refugee from Guinea and has been in foster care for the past 6 months. He was separated from his family during the journey to the host country and has not had any contact with them since. He's been placed with a foster family that has two younger children, ages 8 and 10. All right, Imran tends to keep to himself, often retreating to his room and avoiding family activities. He becomes visibly uncomfortable when his foster parents try to discuss his past or offer emotional support. Additionally, when asked to participate in household tasks or family decisions, he either refuses or gives minimal responses like whatever or I don't care. Finally, Imran's foster parents notice that he rarely seeks comfort when upset and instead prefers to handle things on his own. For example, when his foster father once tried to talk to him about his past, offering to listen if Imran wanted to share, he stiffened and said, I don't want to talk about it, before abruptly leaving the room. Which attachment style does his behavior most closely match in this regard? I'm going to give a quick moment. This one was a little trickier, right? This one's a little trickier. But avoidance would be the most close match to the behavioral representations in this case scenario. Though there are elements of anxious and disorganized as a combination of the anxious and the avoidant, is most closely matches avoidant overall in terms of not wanting to discuss one's past, being very isolated to oneself, also recognizing the age, once again, the influence that he is 17 years old. All right, back to you, Claire.
Thanks, Jenna. And we are on to our third and final learning objective for today's webinar, which is applying practical strategies and interventions to alleviate attachment-related challenges that URMs experience. So we're going to be talking about 3 different strategies or interventions today, including trauma-informed care approaches, supportive and empowering practices, as well as community and peer support. So to start, we'll talk about using that trauma-informed care approach, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. If not, or if you're looking for a refresher, in our recommended resources at the end, we'll have lots of different tools, webinars, and guides that you can look through on our resource library to learn a little bit more and dive into trauma-informed care. But we know that using this approach, it helps to create emotional safety, recognize and respond to trauma-related behaviors, and support collaborative relationships that ultimately foster trust. It also helps minimize re-traumatization and allows URMs to build healthier attachment patterns at the beginning and begin the process of healing from past trauma. So it does this by using that positive and trusting relationships, supporting a holistic view of clients, making sure that we're not missing any areas that are important to youth. And it also seeks to minimize any of those possible trauma triggers. On the next slide, some of you may be familiar with the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. This is a really great visual to use as a strategy to alleviate attachment-related behaviors in URMs. We're going to highlight just a few of these. So the first being safety, which establishing a safe and predictable environment is so essential for helping URMs feel secure and supported to reduce that stress and anxiety. Next important one to highlight is trustworthiness and transparency. So by building trust and rapport through consistent and compassionate interactions, it's crucial for fostering a healthy attachment and the ability to promote that healing. And finally, focusing on cultural, historical, and gender issues. We should always be mindful and prioritizing cultural considerations when we're thinking through working with unaccompanied refugee minors. And as difficult as it is to evaluate each culture and that accepted attachment theory that goes along with those, it's still important that we're doing so and being open and flexible and mindful and continuing that learning and practicing that cultural humility. So, for example, some cultures don't recognize the adolescent years, where we have learned about and talked about in this presentation, and know much of the identity formation happens in these adolescent years, but again, it might not be recognized in a certain culture. In these cultures, youth are expected and already are in that primal adult life journey. They're working, getting married, and even bearing kids. So, as we looked through those developmental stages and how they impact, we want to make sure that we're going further and we're thinking through how that looks in other cultures and communities that youth are arriving from. As for gender, we always want to keep in mind and note that gender roles and expectations are going to vary in different cultures and different languages and different settings as well. And this is all going to impact attachment formation. So we could encourage you to dive deeper into these 6 principles to explore how they also might help alleviate attachment-related challenges to URMs. And in the following slides, we'll start talking about some different strategies and interventions, with our next being supportive practices for foster parents and staff. Foster parents and staff can help build resilience and post-traumatic growth by leveraging neuroplasticity, which counters the harmful effects of trauma with positive experiences. Neuroplasticity allows our brain to adapt and change. So this assists and helps URMs develop healthy coping mechanisms, as well as shift from those negative thinking patterns that were familiar and accessible to them. So for example, you may use an engagement activity such as gardening. What this can help provide opportunities for them to open up, explore conversation about their past, counteract the trauma, improving mood and family engagement, especially if this is something that's done with a foster parent or youth that's living in the home with them as well. Foster parents and staff can also maintain consistent and predictable interactions to help URMs develop a sense of security and stability. So by minimizing placement changes, when changes are necessary, making sure that we're providing that clear information on why and how we're going to be supporting the youth through this transition or change. For example, you could encourage foster parents in the home to incorporate a visual calendar that outlines daily routines, as this can help reduce anxiety and build trust through consistency. And finally, you may want to consider providing training on the attachment theory that we discussed and these effective practices for foster parents and staff to feel confident and enhance their ability and access to resources to support URMs. Next, we'll talk about empowering practices. So, foster parents and staff can empower URMs by building that trust and rapport through, like we said, consistent interactions, such as spending the time daily, engaging in shared interests, by being honest, realistic, patient, there's consistent again, and transparent. And also making sure that you're giving information and you're doing these things, being patient, consistent, and transparent in a way that is understood to the youth that you're speaking with. So you might have to adapt how you deliver information from one youth to another, from one family to another, etc. And of course, promoting agency, offering choices. This is a really big way that you can help empower youth to feel safe and secure and to alleviate those attachment behaviors. Making sure that you're obtaining consent for significant decisions. This not only helps youth feel and build more independence, but it also starts incorporating the importance of using consent in all aspects of life and creating a trauma-informed environment. So by this, we mean we may consider minimizing loud noises, setting up a quiet space in a corner for youth to have some time to regulate. All of these things further ensure that URMs feel in control, they feel safe, valued, and heard. The last practice that we have is foster parents and staff can build community and peer support for URMs by offering opportunities for them to choose, so choices, activities that align with their interests, and meet new peers and implement culturally sensitive and inclusive practices. When you're doing this, you'll want to make sure that you are respecting and thinking through the diverse backgrounds and incorporating cultural traditions, making sure again that URMs are feeling heard, they're feeling valued and supported. This can help provide successful integration into their new community. All right, and to wrap up our session here today, to close everything that we've talked about, going back to defining trauma, talking about the adolescent stages, the attachment types, we're going to wrap it all together by going back and recalling Emron recalling Emron in our previous case scenario. So we're going to put the case scenario, or you can refer back to in the chat. But what strategies or interventions might you incorporate into your service delivery to alleviate attachment-related challenges? And I apologize all. This one is supposed to be for Maria. So we'll put Maria back in the chat, 16-year-old from Honduras. So schedule a regularly enjoyable activity, using trauma-informed approach, absolutely. When foster mom leaves, have her give a specific time. She'll be back and clear. Yes, absolutely. That's that transparency, setting expectations, asking her what she wants to be involved in for after-school activities, exploring different hobbies. And keeping in mind that when you ask these questions, youth may not know the answer to them yet. They might have to be shown what's available for them. So what does an after-school activity mean? What different clubs are there? Do you want to go and explore them and try them out, taking a friend or having foster parent or caseworker join with them for the first couple of times? Set expectations of how long the foster parent will be gone and who she can contact. I love that proactive safety planning there, giving her a sense of safety and security by having options if she does start to feel that anxiety again. Okay, great. I love these. And I'm seeing some themes come across here, focusing on different activities, keeping routines, making sure that she feels safe and reassured, and engaging the foster parents. So let's go ahead and now let's recall Emron. And we're going to do the similar situation here. So we can actually continue using this QR code, this slide that you are already on, and we can start thinking about Emron. So Emron was 17 years old from Guinea, and we'll re-put his case scenario in the chat here and thinking through the same thing. What strategies or interventions might you incorporate? Foster parents don't need to elicit information about his trauma. They've made it aware that they know and they're available to talk. Right. I love this. So we're not pushing what we think will be best. We are offering what's available and waiting for them to have the autonomy and the choice to process through. Prepare food from his place of origin. I love this. I think that's a great example. This could be something that he could teach the family. It could be something they do together. If he wanted to start out by doing that separately, and then maybe the next week you have the foster parents and family try and do it on their own. Get involved in activities like gardening, building trust. Absolutely. Be more proactive with trying to do things to involve him. Absolutely. Give him different choices for chores. I can remember, this is a really good one. I remember as a previous recruiter that sometimes foster parents get stuck on their own routines of familiarity and normalcy. And so you have to encourage them to switch up things too, because they have to be just as vulnerable and adaptable as we're expecting youth who are being welcomed into a new community and norms. So I appreciate that. Refer to therapy, of course, using our resources that we have, learning more about his culture and understanding likes and dislikes. These are all really thoughtful, helpful responses. I hope that maybe thinking through some of these things you can take into your own work and start implementing or asking questions with youth or different case managers to see how you can start to try and or continue alleviating some of these attachment related behaviors. So thank you so much, everyone, for engaging on our Slidos and for taking the time to listen. We are going to use this opportunity to hear from you. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put those into the chat, and Jenna and I will take our shot at answering them.
Hi, Claire. We actually have one that came through just as you were finishing up the Slido. And this question is asking for any tips about obtaining consent when a youth is refusing to make a decision. The example that was given is actually saying if there was an unexpected placement disruption and the youth now has two options for a new placement, but in quotes, they drag their heels when they're asked for their input, how do you kind of encourage them to make a decision and to keep going? My initial thought when I read this is that maybe there's that fear, that avoidance, right, of making the wrong decision, especially when it comes to anyone who's experienced trauma. Decision-making skills have not been developed. They have not had the opportunity to develop those skills. They haven't been presented with the chances to exercise that. So there can be some fear and some apprehension around maybe making what they would consider the wrong decision. So that inaction on their part is a fear-based response as to, well, it's a fear of the unknown. So I think one of the first things that I would do is to recognize and acknowledge that fear and work with that individual through that to see how best we can soothe those concerns to help usher them towards a decision. Do you have anything else, Claire, that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Jenna, and thank you for that question. As you were talking through what you would offer, one of the things that came to mind is maybe the choice. So doing a great job at offering the two choices for placement. But as Jenna said, that might feel overwhelming. That might feel like they're going to make the wrong decision. So I would wonder if you could break those two choices down into smaller ones. So what does the housing dynamic look like at both spaces? How many people would be living there? Thinking through the activities that take place in the new placement, the languages that are spoken, and just trying to break it down to feel a little bit smaller to where they're learning about what the placement will look like in their decisions. Um, so between that validation and that empowering that you shared, and then also being a little bit more creative with building up the confidence to make a choice on where they would prefer to go, those would be my immediate suggestions. Let's see. Is there anything else in the chat that I missed?
Mhm. I believe we answered all that are in the chat right now, but we did have a few that were submitted a little bit earlier ahead of the webinar. So we have one that says, how do you support foster parents when foster parents report concerning behaviors or feelings from foster youth, but the foster youth don't really see it as unusual or as a problem?
Sure, thank you. So this one's a little bit tricky to answer specifically since we don't have all of the context on what the behaviors are. But a generalized answer that we might consider for this is thinking through and managing expectations. So is this a cultural or a societal or home-based experiences and expectations where these concerning behaviors are showing up? So for example, if this is a problem that's only in the home or it's only in the school, you are going to be kind of taking different routes in order to try and in order to address those concerning behaviors and the feelings that foster parents and foster youth are having. And I think also just normalizing that you might not get on the exact same page as an adult who is identifying behaviors being concerning versus a youth identifying those behaviors being concerning. And so finding that middle ground and leveraging your expectations to come to that middle ground is how I would try and address this. And then Jenna, I actually have one question for you that came through um, prior to the live webinar as well. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how schools can support these attachment related challenges and what schools can do, as we know that URMs are absolutely in that school aged category.
Oh, absolutely. Very critical time. Our kids spend so much time in school. So that is the perfect learning opportunity for multiple things, not just academics, but also social skills as well. The first thing that I would like to recommend is to always model the behavior, model the social skills and the interactions that you want any of the youth to demonstrate. Observing modeled behavior is one of the oldest ways that we learn, and we teach through action. So I like to tell people all the time that wherever language barriers exist, we can show what it is that we're trying to convey through our behavior and our body language. When appropriate, something we've mentioned already is to provide choices to students. Choices are very important because they promote empowerment and they provide opportunities to exercise the decision-making skills that we're hoping the youth can learn to develop. Like as we mentioned before, they may not have had the opportunities, and they're not going to get the opportunities if we don't present them sometimes. We want to provide encouragement instead of praise. When you're talking about how to support children in school, I think the default sometimes is to say, oh, great job, excellent job, this looks great, glad that you did this. But that's praise, and praise emphasizes the final product. And so sometimes that final product is not really what we're looking for. We need to be encouraging the effort that went into getting to whatever that final product might look like. So encouragement is different from praise in the way that it helps to build self-efficacy through recognizing the efforts and the growth that occurred through the process. All right. When it comes to supporting in the school system, we want to be reliable and consistent. One of the beautiful things about school is that it's structured, is that there are times for different tasks. And we want to make sure that we're adhering to those times on a consistent basis, because when consistency is hindered, we want to be able to communicate those changes ahead of time, as that can cause someone's anxiety to peak. And as we know, that there are different attachment styles, but as you recognize, anxious is one of the most common. So we want to do things that are going to decrease anxiety. But another key thing here is to avoid excusing behaviors in school. We're in the business of wanting to do corrective modeling. So we want to be able to explain where the behavior that's being presented is not the appropriate or not the preferred choice. And so we cannot do that if we're excusing the behaviors. We want to correct them in a nurturing, but in a very direct way. From a wraparound approach in the school systems, you want to develop a multidisciplinary team, whether you're the teacher, or the counselor, the administrator. You want to bring different people into the fold together, all of those individuals in that school setting that have a hand in shaping and molding the attachment of that child. You want to work together to develop interventions that complement one another, not contradict. And so one of those ways is to develop a multidisciplinary team amongst all of you in that environment. Okay. I mentioned earlier about co-regulation. You want to be able to help the youth name their emotions in the school system when they're feeling frustrated, when they're feeling mad. As a therapist, one of the things that I have used are the mood charts, because sometimes we need more words other than mad, other than sad. Maybe it's really frustrated, maybe it's really disappointed. And so we want to be able to name those emotions to be able to help regulate those emotions. And I think one of the biggest things that we can do is teaching our kids how to access the supports ahead of time. We don't want to create a plan for a child after a situation has happened. We want to be proactive. And so one of those things that we could do on the preventative side is to show who can you go to when you're feeling this way? Who can you go to when you're having difficulties, and identifying those supports early on, okay? And last bit of advice that I can think of that can be helpful is to give responsibilities, to make them maybe a classroom helper, an administrative helper in some small capacity. Something so small like that can have wonderful positive effects with a sense of belonging and a sense of responsibility. And it helps that child know that they're important and in this space.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I hope that you have all been able to take something away from today. Just a recap of our learning objectives in the beginning here. We now hope that you're able to define trauma and explain its impact on attachment, recognize those behavioral representations, and apply practical strategies and interventions in order to alleviate attachment-related challenges. So if we still have you here, we would love to have you and ask you to help us out so that we can help you going forward. You can go ahead and scan the QR code with your camera on your phone, or we will be dropping the link to the SurveyMonkey in the chat. The survey is extremely important to help us improve future trainings and webinars. It's 3 questions long and it only takes 30 seconds. So if you're able to, please take 30 seconds now to complete this survey. Otherwise, if you're able to go and complete that at a later time, that would be extremely appreciated by us. You will also find in the chat the recommended resources that we felt would be applicable for you all regarding this topic. We have 2 slides with different resources that have our switchboard opportunities and resource libraries, and then even some external resources for you all, which you will find in the chat, as well as will be included in the follow-up email that you receive from this webinar. So thank you again. For more training and technical assistance, please stay connected with Switchboard. Email us at switchboard@rescue.org. Visit us at switchboardta.org and follow us on social media at switchboardta. On behalf of all of us at Switchboard, thank you for learning with us, and we hope to see you again very soon.